leaders in their own right for accelerating the transition towards electric transportation in this great state. Part of what we're focusing on today is Mndot's state EV infrastructure deployment plan that is due by August 1st. For this reason, we brought together every key entity necessary for transitioning that plan to effective deployment of EV charging across Minnesota. We have state legislators who have demonstrated leadership on EVs, Mndot, which is developing the plan, Minnesota Federal Highway Division office that works closely with them, and we have the new Federal Joint Office for Energy and Transportation that issued the guidance on and will be receiving the plan. We also have the U.S. Department of Transportation Secretary's Office, which has led the country in this effort under Secretary Pete Buttigieg. But most importantly, we have you, the stakeholders, you're here. And through your input, we are going to help to make the future of transportation work for Minnesotans. So we encourage you to use the chat box available at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen to ask any questions that arise during the forum. If you have questions that we don't get to during the panels, please ask them during the breakout sessions. The breakout sessions later in the program offer you really an ideal chance to make your voice heard and to help shape Minnesota's plan. Every question is helpful for Mndot as they prepare to submit their plan to the joint office. I wish we had time for longer introductions, but for the sake of time, we have a lot of people on today. We're going to keep introductions short, but each speaker's bio will be available on the Plug in America website. So starting off, I'm honored to introduce Tim Sexton, the Chief Sustainability Officer and Assistant Commissioner of Sustainability and Health at Mndot, Wendell Meyer, Federal Highways Division Administrator for Minnesota, Representative Jamie Long, and Senator Senjum to share welcome remarks to the forum. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Joel. Really appreciate everything that Plug in America, Drive Electric Minnesota, and Xcel Energy have done to put this together today. Really an exceptional group of people that are participating, and we're just really excited about this opportunity to build on a lot of the engagement that we've been doing already. Really inspired by the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan requirements from Federal Highways and the Department of Energy and the Joint Office on Energy and Transportation. So we're really hoping to build on that foundation and use this as an opportunity to further, get input to make sure that we're building a network that works for all Minnesotans as we, we try to encourage this clean energy transition in the transportation sector. And, the last thing I would say is that, this really is a monumental opportunity for the state. We've been promoting electrification because of the benefits for health and for the economy and for safety for a number of years. But this is really the jumpstart that we feel like can push this into sort of a new gear. And so we're really excited about that, but we can't do it alone. And so that's where all the panelists today and all the members of the public and stakeholder groups are really going to be valuable for us to do this together if we want to make the long, sustainable progress that's really needed in this area. So big thanks to all the presenters today, but I want to also give a special thanks to our elected officials, Chair Jamie Long with the Minnesota House of Representatives and Chair Dave Senjum with the Minnesota Senate. So thank you all, and really excited about this seminar today, and looking forward to all of your feedback. And with that, I'll pass it over to Wendell Meyer, who's the Division Administrator for the Federal Highway Administration in Minnesota. Thanks, and nice to see you, Wendell.
Thanks, Tim. And a lot of ditto of what you said. I just a few points I wanted to mention kind of before we get started. First, I'd like to thank Mndot and the other partners. I'm not going to mention them all here in the forum today because I'm going to leave someone out. So again, I want to just thank you for inviting the Minnesota Division and for giving us a seat at the table. just in context, the bipartisan infrastructure law was enacted as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. US DOT uses Bill. It's shorter than INJA. So we use Bill. And anyway, that was enacted last November. And Bill makes really the most transformative investments in electric vehicle charging in the United States history. And that puts us on a path to really achieve a nationwide network of 500,000 chargers by 2030 that ensures a convenient, reliable, affordable, equitable charging experience for all users. And so in a nutshell, the network will accelerate equitable adoption of electric vehicles, including for those that cannot reliably charge at home, reduce transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, and help the U.S. on a path to net zero emissions by no later than 2050. And really, this is paramount here, position the United States industries to lead global transportation electrification efforts and create good jobs. Boiling that down, looking at the Nevi program guidance that came out in February, broad stakeholder and public engagement, strong partnerships, and dedicated planning are some key elements that support the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. I look forward to today's engagement in these areas and others that really can help Mndot and its partners move forward in developing the initial electric vehicle infrastructure deployment plan for Minnesota. And I say initial because I think there's an opportunity to make sure the document's livable, nimble, flexible, that works for all of Minnesota. So thank you, and will participate today as I can. So with that, I think I will turn it over to either Representative Jamie Long or Senator Senjum.
Sure. Thank you, Wendell, and I'll let Senator Senjum close us out. So thank you all so much for the invitation to be here. I am excited to talk about electric vehicles and the opportunity that we have here. We know that the vehicle transportation sector is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Minnesota. We know that electrification of our vehicles is one of the most important things that we can do to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions in our state. And that's why we've been pushing so hard in the House to move forward on electric vehicle deployment. And we know that the infrastructure is the backbone of that deployment and is going to be really critical. And we heard in our committee from the auto manufacturers who've said this is the direction that their industry is headed. We know that Chrysler is going to be all electric, they've said, by 2028, and General Motors by 2035. We need to get working now if we want the vehicles that Minnesotans are going to be buying now and in the years to come to have the infrastructure needed to support them. And we also know that that is not equally distributed, and that greater Minnesota has more room to grow in terms of getting infrastructure built out, and the corridors that Mndot and others have put together are really important, both for greater Minnesota drivers, but also for folks from the metro who want to vacation, want to see family across the state, but reducing that range anxiety and helping folks know that they can have electric vehicle charging infrastructure wherever they need to go is critical. And so that's why I think the single most important thing we can do is come up with state matching funds to help support the $68 million that have been dedicated to the state of Minnesota for the electric vehicle charging build out as part of Nevi. And that would be a real bargain for a $13.6 million match from the state. So I'm very much hoping that we can come back in a special session and try to pass bills that will help support that state level match. And that's something that Representative Frank Hornstein, who chairs the Transportation Committee in the House, and I called for last week in an op-ed in the Star Tribune. And so I'm hopeful that we can come back and at least for these really high priority urgent needs like the electric vehicle infrastructure match dollars, we can at least get that done and make sure that we're moving forward this year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Senjum.
I assume you can hear me. If you can't, please let me know. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to be part of the kickoff of this important conference. As I filled my gas tank this morning in Zumbrota for $64, and that seems like that's an all too often occurrence. I'm certainly reminded that the future of transportation in the state is not filling your tank for $64 every time you go to the gas station. That transportation is going to change. It's going to electrify. We all know that as we even watch the TV commercials. We know the journey we're on. We know where it's taking us, and it's taking us away from fossil fuel vehicles, certainly into an electric world. And we need to move forward, certainly in that direction, to support that transition. And we do that, obviously, by supporting legislation, which will get us on infrastructure dollars. I'm positive by sometime soon that's going to happen. We're not going to leave that money on the table for either electrical vehicle infrastructure or, for that matter, anything else related to transportation or energy transformation. That money is important as we move forward. But I just want to compliment those that put this group together today to talk about this issue. And by the way, you're the champions, you're the torchbearers on this, and we need you certainly legislatively to be involved. We need you across this state in terms of community to be involved, because the message, I think, is loud and clear that transportation is changing. It's going to change to an electrical mode, and we need to certainly move with that. And we need, frankly, to be leaders, and we can do that. As I thought about my little experience in Zumbrota today, filling this tank of gas, I probably myself, living in outstate Minnesota, Rochester as the case might be, and yes, we have plenty of chargers and so on and so forth, but we need more. I think every one of us would have a little anxiety if we had an electric car, and many of you do, that we need to fill out this state with opportunities to be able to travel our state, frankly, our nation, with the assurance that we can get from here to there with confidence and with the idea in mind that we've got a reliable trip, we're going to make it home, and all will be good. So again, thank you so much for all being here today, for the opportunity for me to speak briefly and to amplify the message, if you will, that has been given and will be given during this particular conference about the need to move forward. We're going to do that. We're going to do that certainly in the House and Senate, and I'm pretty confident by sometime soon the governor will sign a bill and we'll be on our way. So thank you so much for the opportunity to visit.
Thank you all for those remarks. Thank you for those remarks. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Nancy Daubenberger, the newly appointed commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Transportation, and Andrew Wishnia, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation, to deliver our keynote addresses. We're very fortunate to have the highest leadership in transportation, both in Minnesota and at the U.S. DOT, who are so keenly focused on helping us to move the needle towards clean transportation. Thank you.
Thank you, and hello everyone. I'm so happy that you could all make the time today to discuss electric vehicles, and thank you for your participation. I'd also like to send a special thank you to our elected officials who spoke, and I might be repeating a lot of what they already said, but I also want to kind of kick off this discussion by mentioning just a few benefits that EVs offer Minnesotans. So as we've already kind of talked about, but there are numerous benefits, including fewer emissions, cleaner air, lower operating and maintenance costs, and they're part of a comprehensive strategy to reduce climate pollution and promote job growth and innovation in Minnesota. The state is committed to expanding our EV charging infrastructure and accelerating EV adoption. Minnesota was the first state to install signs along an alternative fuel corridor, and we are excited to build on that legacy of leadership. In 2016, the FHWA designated Interstate 94 from Moorhead, Minnesota to Port Huron, Michigan as part of the Great Lakes Zero Emission Corridor. Then several years later, Mndot coordinated with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Great Plains Institute to release a vision for accelerating EV adoption in Minnesota. And the vision set a goal for 20% of light-duty vehicles to be electrified by 2030. Last year, Mndot released the 2021 Minnesota EV Assessment, which builds on that vision and describes the EV market trends, strategies to increase the use of EVs, and the actions the state can take to meet its EV adoption and carbon reduction goals. Minnesota also recently joined Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin in signing the Rev Midwest MOU to create a partnership to work together on EV charging and vehicle electrification with a focus on addressing electrification needs for heavy-duty trucks. Rev Midwest sets the stage to work together on increasing the number of EVs and EV chargers in our region. Today, over 26,000 electric vehicles are registered in Minnesota. This represents less than 1% of light-duty vehicle registrations, but the numbers are growing fast, and we expect significantly more EVs on the road in the coming years based on support from the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or I'll refer to it as the Nevi program, that was established in the Infrastructure and Jobs Act law and other related programs as well. So the Nevi program will transform our transportation system and bolster our economy. Minnesota will use the Nevi funds to create a convenient, accessible, and reliable statewide network of fast chargers. It's important for the network to benefit rural residents and disadvantaged communities in our state. Mndot does not intend to own or operate the fast chargers that are installed with the Nevi funds, but instead we plan to manage a competitive process to select sites and partner with private companies to install, own, operate, and maintain the chargers. This program presents an incredible opportunity to spur economic development, and Minnesota does not want to leave money on the table. Strong partnerships will be essential to the success of this program, and Mndot is working with traditional funding partners and stakeholders to create a network for all Minnesotans. Some of those partners are our Federal Highway Administration, utility companies, the EV industry, tribes, other state agencies, and local government partners, just to name a few. So we're excited to hear from you all today, and we plan to provide additional engagement opportunities in the future. So thank you again for your participation.
Well, it's such an honor to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted for the opportunity to speak with you all today. Thanks to Minnesota, Plug in America, for hosting this call. As the Department of Transportation dives in on building a safer, a more equitable, a more modern, climate-friendly transportation system, I couldn't be more thrilled to be with this group, as your partnership at the state level is really going to be critical to our success. DOT's climate work stretches across the transportation modes, as most of you know, jumpstarting, bike and pedestrian projects, ensuring that communities have access to reliable public transit, challenging the aviation industry to drive down their emissions, and so much more. But today, I want to focus specifically on our electric vehicle work, naturally, as this has been quite an exciting time. Look, we know that EVs are the cars of the future. You all know that the auto industry, with demonstrated support from their consumers, have already made huge strides in moving in this direction. But we have to ensure three things, right? We have to ensure that the shift will happen, one, quickly enough to make a meaningful difference in the fight against the climate crisis. Two, that EVs and EV chargers are made in America by American workers. And three, that they'll be affordable and accessible enough for every American driver to reap the benefits. And as you've already heard, and you're already probably well aware, EVs have a myriad of benefits. They're cheaper to both fuel and maintain. They don't produce harmful air emissions like internal combustion engines do. We know that these pollutants disproportionately impact disadvantaged communities in particular. And we're committed to make the deployment of the EV charging network equitable. ensuring that the benefits accrue to underrepresented and disadvantaged communities. So this network must be fully accessible to all EV users, regardless of whether they live in an urban area or a rural area. And to help with this, US DOT recently published an EV Rural Toolkit to ensure that resources are equitably targeted, available, and known. The truth is nobody benefits more from EVs than people who live in rural areas because they're the ones who drive the most, and they're the ones who stand to save the most money on gas and maintenance. And then additionally, through the Justice 40 initiative, we will be ensuring that at least 40% of the benefits of our EV program's investments will flow to disadvantaged communities. I think Minnesota knows this. This work is going to take all of us. We in the federal government have been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to lead the electric vehicle revolution, and we need your help. President Biden's historic bipartisan infrastructure law marks the largest investment in EV infrastructure in American history. So we've rolled out the first part of that investment, a $5 billion national EV infrastructure formula program, which, as you heard, we call Nevi, for states to begin to build out a nationwide EV charging network. And I know this program is of keen interest to this group as Minnesota works on crafting its state EV charging plan this summer. In February, we issued guidance on how states can and should use their allotted money. And the guidance focuses on providing information for states on the strategic deployment of EV chargers on interstate and designated highway corridors, while also establishing key technical guidance and explicitly addressing administration priorities such as Justice 40 and workforce development. The guidance also outlines, where stations should be located and some general characteristics about their charging capacity. It outlines allowable uses of Nevi funds. It outlines the process and contents of state EV infrastructure deployment plans and how states should consider other priorities like equity and workforce development as well. And very soon, we'll also be issuing minimum standards and requirements for EV chargers funded by our new programs. To implement this funding, we're also collaborating very closely with our colleagues at the Department of Energy on the exciting new Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which will coordinate our efforts on EV charging and provide information and resources on EV charging to stakeholders and the public. So one thing I wanted to leave you all with, we encourage you all to take a look at the office's new website at driveelectric.gov. The website has a subscribe button, which will be a good way to sign up for email updates on technical assistance offerings, such as upcoming webinars. And the Joint Office will share more information later, but they'll be at the front lines of working with states on developing their state plans that align with federal requirements and help ensure a truly national EV charging network. And then in addition to the Nevi formula program, the bill also provides several other programs that will help electrify our cars and trucks. Later this year, we will be implementing a $2.5 billion discretionary grant program to strategically deploy publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure and other alternative fueling infrastructure. Among eligible entities, this funding will be available to local governments like those you serve. And this funding will be broken into a couple of different programs. One is a corridor charging grant program, and then the other is a community charging grant program for charging and fueling infrastructure in communities. The Port Infrastructure Development Program grants can also support the electrification of port infrastructure in your communities, including places for cars and trucks to plug in. And the Federal Transit Administration is also administering the Low and No Emission Vehicle Program, as well as the Bus and Bus Facilities Program, both of which cities and towns can use to decarbonize their transit fleets. The federal funding will directly jumpstart a national EV charging network and also can catalyze additional private investment, to help provide a convenient, a reliable, affordable, and equitable national EV charging network. So the opportunities abound. But in conclusion, DOT's goal in supporting the deployment of EV charging is to make EV charging infrastructure part of the surface transportation system. The charging system that we help to build out must integrate into a larger, clean, safe, equitable affordable, efficient, and safe transportation system, state DOTs and energy offices are going to be critical partners as they craft their EV charging plans. And as we move forward, there will be even more crucial opportunities for state leaders like yourselves to help move us forward. We're really looking forward to collaborating with you as we work to electrify our nation's fleets, and just want to thank you all for the opportunity to appear before you. Thanks again.
So thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Nancy. We really appreciate your leadership on this. So our next speaker is going to be Corey Cantor from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. And Corey is going to give us kind of a global and US picture on what's happening with EVs. So thanks, Corey.
Hey, Joel, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen now, and let's do the entire screen here. You guys can now see my presentation, right? Just see anything yet? Sorry. You can't see anything yet? Okay. Sorry for just a moment, having like screen share issues.
You always build in time for this type of thing, no worries.
Yeah, sometimes Cisco can be, yeah. No, it's like a permission screen. You can see me? Oh, that's good. Let's try one more time. And if not, what I can do, Joel, is I'll send over my PowerPoint, or I can come on after the next speaker, whatever you guys prefer. Sorry about that. It's just it's basically saying I don't have permission to share content. Okay, Ellie, let me just send it to you. And while I'm doing that, my name is Corey Cantor. I'm with Bloomberg NEF. For those of you who do not know us, we're basically a premier research firm that looks at the transition of electric vehicles. We just put out our new report last month, which basically looks at not only the future of EVs here in the US, but around the world. And I guess it's a good time to really highlight essentially where we see EVs growing worldwide. Okay. Well, if you check your email in about 1 second, I'm just going to stop that. And then just forward my email there. Okay. All right, Ellie, if you check out, I just forwarded the email with the attachment. And I'll try and go through quickly just with the top line stuff. And apologies everyone for the technical difficulties. We're definitely a Zoom franchise. So feel free to take presenter back and I can just talk through it. Basically, no surprise compared to last year, we continue to see the global growth of the electric vehicle space. Back in 2021, there were about 6.6 million EVs sold globally. And here in the United States, there was about 656,000. So to kind of line up where the US is going into our kind of long-term outlook, basically, we find the US a bit behind to start. So in Europe, where you were seeing EV share of sales in many countries going over about, let's say, 20% in certain countries, in China doing quite well on that percentage as well. The US was about 4.7% last year. So, you were coming from an environment where the US was doing about 2.2% EV share of sale and moving more into this kind of macro space. And Ellie has the slides ready, so thank you for pulling those up. Feel free to share them, and I'll kind of go through quickly. But no surprise really that given the lack of policy at the federal level and the kind of growing model availability over time, that the U.S. was trailing a bit. But I'll kind of outline in the remaining time, where this space is. Thanks, Ellie. So if you could go to the next slide. It's no surprise that EVs are all over the news, whether or not you're checking, Bloomberg or other sources. Automakers can't stop making an announcement about EVs. One thing that we try to do at BNEF is look at not just the announcements being made, but where the data shows where we've been and where we're moving towards. Next slide. And we're really on a cusp of a major shift in the EV industry, which is a far cry from about 10 years ago. Global EV sales were just at about 200,000 units. Next slide. And EVs have come a long way. Oh, and interesting. Yeah, I'm sorry for the charts a little bit on that slide, because it's maybe an Apple to PowerPoint issue. But go a couple slides down, Ellie. I just want to make sure that they've come through okay. Otherwise, I could just talk through it. EV sales hit over 1 million units in 2017, and then by 2019 over 2 million units. And then, as I said, last year, they reached about 6.6 million units. So you could go ahead to the next 2 slides. And next. And so that final sales number in 2021 were about more than 6 times 2017 numbers, which again is kind of the outline of where our outlook is. So next slide. And the passenger EV space is growing as well. And so we look at this data, and with it, we kind of move towards the trends. And if you could go to the next slide. Okay, I think at least on my end, Ellie, they are not coming off clearly. So I think I'll just talk through the rest of it if that's okay. Yeah, so I'll send out, or I'll make sure that we can get this deck information across. Basically at BNEF, what we see is that at least in the US, passenger vehicles are going to improve from that about 600,000 EVs sold last year. It is clear on your end? Okay. If you guys could see, okay, sorry to be going back and forth. At least on my end, I couldn't see the axes on the slides. But as we move towards 2025, really, we're going to see, yeah, exactly. Some of the commenters are placing out the graphs, but no labels. It was a PowerPoint to Google slide issue. As we're moving forward, really, we're going to see the US begin to pick up and not do as well as China or Europe, given the fact that the model availability has been limited. And not only that, the production side. Nevertheless, we see EV sales reaching about over 2 million units by 2025. And that EV share of sale, which, you look at the Department of Transport and you look at the fuel economy standards, has been kind of a key metric. We expect that to reach over 16% by 2025. Now, as you approach the longer term, there's going to be a lot of work needed at both the kind of federal policy level, as well as by the state and local makers like yourselves, as well as automakers, really taking those commitments that I outlined at the beginning and putting them into action in terms of the actual production of EVs. Otherwise, you're going to have this kind of bifurcation between the European markets, which has a kind of stronger policy support. They have a CO2 emissions program, which really requires emissions to be cut by about 55% by the end of this decade, compared to the US, which has President Biden's 50% EV share of sales goal by 2030, but no fuel economy standards in place that will take us through the rest of the decade. That being said, we see some strong fundamentals for the US market, given two-car home ownership, given the automakers that are based here that are setting goals like GM's 2035, ICE phase-out goal. There's a lot of positive movement happening. We see in the next year about 1.2 million EV sales in the US, even given supply constraints. Nevertheless, there's going to be a lot of work in partnership to be done. My apologies for some of the technical difficulties. What I think would be useful for folks is we have shared the kind of top line executive summary results of our long-term electric vehicle outlook that just came out a couple days ago. If you Google Bloomberg NEF EVO, you can find our public website. A lot of our information is behind closed doors. So you can see not only the information I've kind of discussed a little bit on the passenger vehicle sales, but really commercial vehicles and buses and 2- and 3-wheelers, which are a big part of the story too. I'll close by saying by 2040, we expect about 727 million electric vehicles sold worldwide, which means that there's a lot of exciting opportunity ahead for the US and countries across the world. We are in a supply crunch, as you can see from the high upfront prices of all vehicles and rising gas prices, but that means that there's just a lot more work for folks to do. So if you have any further questions, and I think the whole link was shared, feel free to reach out, and apologies for the technical difficulties. And thanks for the opportunity, Dean and Joel.
Okay. Thank you, Corey. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but I think we got the general message is that EVs are really taking off very rapidly. That's kind of what I took away from this, that we're a little behind other places, but things are going quickly here. So next, we're going to hear from Diane Turchetta, the Senior Advisor to the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, and Siri Simons, Sustainability Program Manager at Mndot, on the available corridor charging funding from the IIJA and the development of Minnesota's state EV infrastructure deployment plan. So welcome.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? Okay, are we good?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi there. My name is Diane Turchetta, and I'm formerly with the Federal Highway Administration, but on loan right now to the new Joint Program Office, the Energy and Transportation Joint Program Office, to help set up the Nevi program and implement it. So just wanted to start off by following up on a few details that Andrew Wishna mentioned in terms of the Nevi program, and wanted to really start out with a timeline and exactly what deadlines we are aiming for and where we are going down the road here. And you heard Wendell mention at the beginning of the webinar the February 10th deadline. There was National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Guidance issued on February 10th. And also that same day, we issued a 6-round request for nominations for the Federal Highway Alternative Fuel Corridor Program, which I'll explain how they connect in a little while. So Andrew also mentioned that we are a little late on the 180-day minimum standards and requirements. I guess that's the 200-day and plus minimum standards requirements. But as he said, that will be issued very soon with some other helpful information. August 1st was mentioned. That's a big date in the Nevi program. The state EV deployment plans are due to the JPO office that day. And if you go on the JPO website, driveelectric.gov, you can see there's a template for those states. And we're encouraging states to use that template to make it a little bit easier for everyone to follow the plan and exactly the components of the plan. Finally, after those plans are reviewed and kind of analyzed by the technical folks in the JPO office, they'll go to Federal Highway and they'll be stamped with a certification. And after that, states are free to use their funding and start installing EV infrastructure in the ground. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the Nevi formula program. So this is the $5 billion program out of the bipartisan infrastructure law for EV corridors. About $1 billion a year, FY 2022 through 2026. Minnesota's share in FY 2022 was a little over 10 million, and the 5-year total is a little over 68 million. So these funds, once again, are for just electric vehicle infrastructure along designated alternative fuel corridors. So these are the corridors that were designated over the last 5 years by Federal Highway as alternative fuel corridors. We just talked about the EV deployment plan. The bill also sets aside 10% of the EV formula funding. So 10% of that money will be used for grants to states to basically fill in gaps along the corridors. And as with the discretionary program that Andrew talked about, this is really the 10% grant program and the 2.5 billion discretionary grant program. They're the next things up for development. So stay tuned for more information and details on those. Back to the grant program. The discretionary grant program, as Andrew said, is split into two equal pots. And the program basically covers infrastructure not only for EV charging, but for hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling, which goes along with federal highways, the way we define the alternative fuel corridor program. So we have a pot for corridor charging. This is still tied to the alternative fuel corridors, but for all fuels. And then we have the community charging grant program, which really, as I said, is for all fuels, but for infrastructure located within communities and off corridors. So the grant program has some in Bill. If you look at the eligibility requirements, I don't think there's anything in there that's a surprise in terms of eligible entities, MPOs across the country, unit of local government, pretty much standard eligibilities that you see in other DOT and federal government programs in terms of entities receiving funding. Back to the alternative fuel corridor program. As I said, the whole Nevi program was built upon Federal Highways Alternative Fuel Corridor Program. And over the last 5 years, we've designated corridors across the country. You see the map there. The green solid lines are corridors that were, before the Nevi requirements came out, EV ready. And the other corridors are pending, EV pending, which just meant that they needed a little bit more infrastructure to flip to ready. So this is what the Nevi program is based on. And you can really, if you go into the Federal Highway AFC site, you can really drill down in these maps and look at your own state and, really look at where the corridors start and stop. So it's very useful. Of course, this program had no funding, and this Nevi is a follow-on, which we were all very excited when Bill passed and the program had funding. And we thought basically Federal Highway, along with the states who participated, just about all of them in the program, we laid a great foundation for the Nevi program. So one of the things we're focusing on in this program too is first building out the interstates and then moving to the whole national highway system. So what you see here is basically all the EV corridors that are now designated in the country. And, we just received another round of nominations, our round 6. So you'll see some of those states like Mississippi and South Dakota, their corridors will be filled in as they nominated some of their interstates. So you'll see a much better interconnected, at least at the interstate level, corridors that will be designated as either ready or pending. And I put the website here at the bottom. If you want to really drill down in those maps, the website's there at the bottom on the, it's a HEP-GIS website that has the EV and all the alternative fuel maps available for you to look at. Back to the state EV deployment plans. I know Minnesota is working hard on theirs along with several other states. I know we're going to have maybe a handful of early submittals for the plans as states have to also filter the plans through their own approval process at the states, and that takes a long time. And in terms to hit that August 1st deadline, some of the states will have their at least a draft of their plan in July, but these are some of the components that are asked for by Bill in the deployment plans. And also there's a template on the JPO website, and I mentioned this before, that states can follow. I think it's a pretty easy template to follow. I know it's a lot of information. I know there's a very short time span to do it, but really help states get started in terms of following right down through the template and, you know, developing and putting their information in there. And let me say, I'll be the first to say this is, as I said, this is a very short time span to do this. And we are not expecting any type of gold standard in these plans for the first year. I think we're looking more of a strategic outlook of how the state plans to build out their EV networks. Obviously, the stakeholder input and coordination, there wasn't a lot of time for states to do a full-blown, you know, stakeholder participation. So we're saying whatever you can provide to us in these plans for the first year would be great. And, you know, obviously citing specific sites haven't been, you know, located yet, but just all the things that you have heard and all the things you can put in the plan is all very helpful to kind of giving us a good idea of where the state plans to go with their EV corridors. The Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, as Andrew said, will play a really key role in the implementation of Nevi and the charging infrastructure. There are a lot of great people from various DOE labs to participate and be in the Joint Program Office. And just looking at the website, you can see what's been built up there already, still getting up and running on a lot of things, but looking at tools and data sets and best practices. And, you know, we're working in concert with the Federal Highway Division offices, really to, for them to help us along with our state partners in terms of plan development and any information or data they need along the way. The JPO is there. We've been meeting with states. I think there may be only 1 or 2 states left that we haven't had one-on-ones with in terms of helping them and answering their questions. And once again, that plan on August 1st will go to the JPO and then Federal Highway for approval. And I encourage you to take a look at that website, the JPO website. There's a lot of good information on there. And, you know, you can get a feel for basically, you know, what type of activities the JPO is there to help you with. So in terms of technical assistance, I just mentioned the one-on-ones. We've talked to DC, Puerto Rico, and I think just about 48 or 49 states by now. Anytime state needs other contact names, we assist in coordinating state agencies, teams, and working groups. And one thing we did right off the bat that's been really helpful is establish every points of contact with state DOTs in the Federal Highway Division offices. So when we have a conversation, when there's emails exchanged, everyone knows the questions and the answers, and everyone's kind of on the same page. Also at the federal level, there's an MOU signed between NASDO and NASIO. So that's really helpful from the national level down as the state energy offices and the state DOTs work together. They have that higher level coordination at the at AASHTO and NASIO. And just wanted to mention, we've had I believe two webinars the JPO has. I think the recordings are up on the website, but just wanted to alert everyone that there will be the first equity webinar on June 24th from 2 to 3, Justice 40 webinar, and there's a website there. You can go in and take a look at the description and sign up at that website. So how to follow up, we're always asked this question. In terms of the Nevi formula program, you know, this is obviously, you know, we're there for technical assistance, but this is state DOT, just like any other Title 23 formula program. I think everyone's used to, you know, allocations to state and exactly what a formula program is all about, but there's a state Nevi contact for questions. And, you know, for technical assistance and technical expertise, and that means EV equipment and power levels, etc. I mean, that's what the JPO is there for. And as I said before, we work in concert with the Federal Highway Division offices, who are really the experts. We depend on them for some of the financial management issues, the share, the 20% share, the Title 23 requirements, NEPA questions, and all those things, like I said, are part of Title 23 projects. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen. And I didn't know if you wanted to take questions right now or if you wanted to go on to the next one.
I think we need to move on to the next presenter, but that was really great. Thank you. That was really great information. So Siri, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and I know there were some audio issues, so can people hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good. You sound clear.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Siri Simons. I'm the Sustainability Program Supervisor with Mndot's Division of Sustainability and Public Health. And I'm also the Project Manager for the Minnesota Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan. So Ellie, could you pull up my slides, please? Great, thank you. So I'm going to be talking today about the sort of high-level look at our process for putting together our statewide EV infrastructure deployment plan here in Minnesota. And then I'll also be talking again about really the details of that plan when we have a portion later on in the agenda with a panel on EV charging station implementation. So you can go to the next slide. I'll start by giving a quick overview of the program requirements and our approach to those requirements here in Minnesota. So like Diane mentioned, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program, or Nevi, is really focused on providing funds to states to strategically deploy DC fast chargers. So here in Minnesota, we are slated to receive $68 million over the 5 years of the program. And there is a 20% non-federal match requirement on top of that. So the big deadline that everyone is focused on is providing the plan by August 1st. And that's something that we are working towards here in Minnesota. So you can go to the next slide. So this is a sort of closer look at how we're putting together our plan. We brought on a consultant in April, HDR, and they're helping us work through this process. The first step is really to establish criteria for a DC fast charging network in our state. So the fast charging network that we're developing gives us a sense of where we could spend all 5 years of the formula program funds. So we established those criteria and then we put together the map as a starting point. And then we started to prepare for the alternative fuel corridor application deadline in May. There was some discussion between the project team and a steering committee that's guiding the plan development, and ultimately we decided that we would not be nominating additional corridors. So here in Minnesota, we're focusing on 94 and 35 as the corridors that we'll invest in with the first year of the program funds. So at this point, we are looking at those corridors specifically and identifying potential locations for the chargers along 94 and 35, and then that's what will get rolled up into the plan that we submit to the joint office in August. So you can go to the next slide. So wanted to talk a little bit more about the public and stakeholder participation process before getting into some of the content that we've pulled together so far. Like Diane mentioned, this is a quickly moving process, and so we aren't able to pull together sort of a broad stakeholder involvement plan, but we really did want to make sure that we were engaging key audiences to the extent that we could, given the time that we had. So we do have a website for our plan. I'll drop a link to it in the chat. And it includes our public and stakeholder participation plan. And one of the pieces of that document is a description of the key audiences that we are working to engage. So the first one is the public. Certainly, we want to connect with general members of the public here in Minnesota, both people who drive electric vehicles and people who would like to drive those vehicles, but maybe see some barriers. And then just generally anybody who's impacted by EVs in the EV industry. Then the next audience is our stakeholders. So these would be groups that are impacted by decision making from the plan, but maybe don't have a direct role in implementation. Examples would include advocacy groups, environmental justice groups, or real estate interests. And then the next audience is traditional transportation partners. So these are the types of partners that we work with regularly when it comes to planning for our construction projects. And examples here would be metropolitan planning organizations or MPOs, other state agencies like the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, for example. The next audience is EV infrastructure deployment partners. So this is sort of a newer stakeholder group for us at Mndot. We're working to make sure we're engaging companies that would be installing EV charging stations, as well as utilities who, traditionally have a role in planning for Mndot construction projects, but have even more of a stake in what we're doing with this program because it's so essential to make sure that the electric grid has the capacity to support the chargers that we'll be installing. And then we're also working to coordinate with our 11 tribes in the state of Minnesota and then Mndot staff as well, for whom this is also pretty new. And then you'll see the different engagement strategies listed here too. So I mentioned our website. We have a steering committee that's guiding the development of the plan. And then we have an online survey and comment form that I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, as well as a series of workshops. So we've held 3 virtual stakeholder workshops, and then we're in the process of doing in-person engagement. We were out in Minneapolis and Duluth last week, and then this week we'll be in Albert Lea and Fergus Falls. So we can go to the next slide. I did want to just talk a little bit about what we've heard from our survey so far. So this was one of the first activities that we initiated as part of our development process. We posted a survey on our website for a few weeks in late April and early May, and we're really happy with the response rate. We got about 5,600 responses. We received over 13,000 open-ended comments that our consultant helped us to review and synthesize. And really, we just spread the word through stakeholder emails and targeted social media. So I think that touches on the importance of the work that we're doing, the interest that there is in EVs. We were just really happy with how many Minnesotans we heard from. So you can go to the next slide. These are the key findings from the survey. I think of note was that nearly 40% of respondents plan to or would like to own an EV, but a lack of charging infrastructure is the top reason preventing them from making that purchase. So again, just highlighting the importance of what we're doing with these formula funds. We also asked about where Minnesotans wanted to see the chargers. There was interest in, of course, focusing on interstates, but also prioritizing charging in communities that have the longest travel times. And then you can also see some of the benefits listed on this slide in terms of what people perceive and what they shared in the survey. Next slide. So now I'll talk about the draft EV fast charging network. Like I mentioned, this network is sort of a starting point for us as we think about where we could spend all 5 years of the formula fund. So these are the criteria that we used to put together the draft network. The first criterion was functional class. So we looked at all of our principal arterials first, and then we looked at traffic volume and selected the top 25% of traffic volume or roadways with the top 25% of traffic volume in the state. And then we also looked at connectivity. So we considered how this network provided connections to the neighboring states to Minnesota as well as Canada. And then the fourth criterion was coverage and connectivity to destinations. So we were thinking about how to make sure that there was coverage throughout Minnesota and that drivers could access this network wherever they live in the state, as well as making sure that the network provided connections to some of our key tourist destinations in the Twin Cities, as well as in greater Minnesota, like the Boundary Waters, for example. And then the other criteria listed here include proximity to communities of concern. So we used the Justice 40 polygon data to look at how our network intersected with those communities. We also kind of took into account public input from the survey and then where chargers are currently. So we can go to the next slide. And this is my last slide. So this is the draft EV fast charging network. The green lines show our existing alternative fuel corridors and the blue lines show the potential future network. This is something that we're interested in getting your feedback on today in the breakout session. So we will bring this up again for people to provide input on. And I've been told that I have to wrap it up. So I'll stop here and just say that I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all today. There will be another presentation a little bit later on where we'll get into the details of the first year of funding. So stay tuned for that.
So thank you to you both. I think that was really great. We got to get a pretty good snapshot of the plan and the whole process. So we now have Alex Clegg from the U.S. Department of Transportation Routes Program, which is Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success. And we have MK Anderson with Fresh Energy. And together they'll be covering the unique needs for rural Minnesota and the critical need for the transition to make sure that the transition to clean transportation is just and equitable. So welcome both of you, Alex and MK.
Great, thank you, Joel, and thank you to all of y'all at Plug in America and at Mndot for letting me come and talk to you here today about what we have going on at DOT, focused on EVs for rural communities and rural America. So I have some slides, and I think Ellie, you're going to be advancing those. But one thing that my colleague Andrew Wishnia mentioned earlier during his section is a toolkit that we put out back in February. It's really focused on resources for rural communities that are looking at how to invest in EV infrastructure and how to start building out that network. We try to include this as a resource for folks who may know what an EV is on the road, or may not, or may know all the ins and outs of how to build a charger. So it's designed to be as useful to as wide a range of people as possible. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Just a quick overview before I get too deep into the toolkit. As Joel mentioned, I'm with the Routes Initiative at USDOT, one of the better acronyms, I think, within the department. But our goal is to engage with rural communities, with rural stakeholders, and make sure we have a good understanding at DOT of what the actual on-the-ground issues are that folks are dealing with, and kind of taking that information and feeding it back into all the various modes and offices within the department to make sure that all the programs and grants that are going out to rural communities are as effective as possible, and that the federal dollars are being used as effectively as they can be. And that includes working, outside of DOT with a lot of our other federal partners. USDA especially has such a big presence in rural communities. Make sure that we know of their programs and that they're aware of our programs and able to talk to folks about things like infra grants and raise grants as they come up. So on this next slide, kind of go over some of the rural focused benefits of this transition to electric vehicles. As Andrew mentioned, as I think pretty much everyone else has mentioned, rural communities stand to benefit a lot from electric vehicles. The kind of the basic thinking is, the more you drive, the more you're going to save on each gallon of fuel, not having to buy gas, but instead charging up, the less you're going to have to pay for maintenance. And so, rural communities and rural households tend to drive more than their urban counterparts. The rural households spend roughly 20% more on transportation expenses. They use nearly 50% more fuel. That all kind of stems from the average of 10 more miles per day than urban residents, which doesn't seem like a lot, but when you expand that over 365 days, it can add up to a lot of savings for these households. And that 10 miles a day, to circle back on it real quick before I move on, a lot of folks, when you think about range anxiety and rural communities, you don't want to be at E on your electric vehicle and just be out stranded on the side of the road. But only 10 more miles per day, it's pretty much every vehicle will go 10 miles. So I think industry and charging networks have done a lot to kind of ease that range anxiety and make it possible for pretty much all households to have an EV and know that there are going to be charging stations nearby. And so why now? So why are we making this push right now? So as you may know, President Biden set out a goal to build 500,000 EV chargers nationwide by 2030, and a lot of that is going to be achieved through funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law, using the programs that Diane Tochetta and others talked about earlier. And so we released in February a infrastructure toolkit for rural EVs. It's on the next slide, kind of shows some of the highlights of the toolkit. It's a free resource available to anyone who wants to go and look at it. Transportation.gov/rural is our routes homepage. You can find it on there, or the direct link is transportation.gov/rural/EV/toolkit. And so the toolkit kind of walks through a lot of the benefits that we went over, as well as identifying a lot of the key partners and steps you need to take to get the charging station from idea to completion. That includes working with your utilities, working with your state DOT, working with your state energy offices, everyone you need to work with in the site hosts. And so, again, I only have one more minute, so moving through quickly. If I can go skip ahead 2 slides. If anyone wants to reach out to me after this, in case you want to know more about these slides, I'm happy to share the deck, but I just want to highlight a couple of the upcoming notices of funding opportunity that we have coming out of DOT. Looks like the text got a little garbled in the when everything got put together, but DOT maintains a website of upcoming notices. The QR code right there in the corner of the screen will take you to that link. After I'm finished talking, I will put that link in the chat as well for folks. But the Safe Streets and Roads for All program is a new program focused on safety. I just opened up a couple of weeks ago. We have a slew of new programs, some of which are very connected to EVs, some of which only tangentially, but there's always room thinking about these projects in a holistic way to think about how EV charging can come in. So I am out of time. Thank you again for having me, and please reach out if you have any questions going forward.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me. As mentioned earlier, my name is MK Anderson. I'm a Senior Policy Associate for Fresh Energy, and I head up our clean transportation work. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the opportunity we have to ensure equitable deployment of EV charging infrastructure through the Nevi funding in underserved, historically excluded, and disadvantaged communities in urban areas. So first I want to talk about the importance of this. Communities of color, as well as under-resourced communities, disproportionately have poorer air quality when compared to majority white and middle to high income neighborhoods. And this is in large part due to the fact that many communities of color and under-resourced communities reside near industrial areas, freight corridors, and highway and interstate corridors, as well as because of the racist practice of redlining and the harmful build-out of the current interstate system as a whole, which exposes our residents to exposes the residents of these neighborhoods to a disproportionate amount of transportation sector emissions. We can go to the next slide, please. Exposure to these emissions reduces the quality of life, increases the risk of developing respiratory diseases, and increases the occurrence of hospitalizations and mortality in these areas. So zooming out a little bit, the big picture goal of the Nevi investment is to increase electric mobility and reduce transportation emissions through the electrification of vehicles. We are doing so by building out a public charging network. The purpose of public charging and public funding is to fill in the gaps in the private sector, meaning that public charging stations should be installed and prioritized in underbuilt areas where usage may not be quite high enough yet for private sector entities to build there. While the initial phase of Nevi is geared towards corridor charging, there are still opportunities within that to address broader public charging goals, such as ensuring those who cannot install home charging will have access to vehicle charging infrastructure near their home or workplace, reducing significant barriers to EV adoption. This can be accomplished by ensuring that Nevi charging hubs are sited as close to or within dense urban areas as possible, while still fulfilling other Nevi requirements on location. Not only do we need to ensure that we are not furthering or recreating the impact of redlining when it comes to EV access, but we also need to work to reduce the harm that has already been done. We can do this by centering our programs around this framework, prioritizing the build out of EV infrastructure in both communities of color and under-resourced communities in urban areas, and most importantly, by working with community representatives to build projects that will serve the community it is intended to serve. Next slide, please. A note on stakeholder engagement. Don't decide on the full scope of the project before you talk with stakeholders. First, meet with stakeholders and work to understand the needs of that community, and then work together to see how your project can help meet some of those needs. Stakeholders should really include community experts or members who have lived in the community for a long time and understand the needs of that community group leaders, neighborhood associations, housing advocates, and regional transportation planning organizations. A great example of this engagement being done successfully can be found through OurCar's placement of charging hubs for its electric vehicle car share service. Next slide, please. A couple station considerations. So we should be thinking about who will use the station, how does the station plug into the surrounding community? So can the station development be part of a larger community project, such as partially serving as the charging infrastructure for a multimodal transportation hub, or being a charging hub for rideshare drivers? A note on that, nearly half of all rideshare rides begin or end in a low-income area. Creating charging hubs will allow drivers to easily charge up in the neighborhood, increasing electric transportation options in these communities. And then we should be thinking about what are the different needs of charging at this location. Should there be more chargers? Should the pricing differ to encourage or enable more EV adoption in the area? And finally, when an interstate goes through an urban area, try to locate the charging station within the metro area instead of locating them just outside the city. Next slide, please. As was mentioned earlier, this funding needs a 20% match. The Minnesota Legislature adjourned the session without coming to an agreement on many things, including state match for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding, meaning that the state is at risk of missing out on a portion of its $7.3 billion to build and maintain necessary infrastructure such as road, bridges, and EV charging networks, as well as funding to create and maintain reliable utility infrastructure, renewable energy production, and much more. The only way for Minnesota to be able to fully leverage this opportunity that's provided to us through the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act funding is for the legislature to come back together in a special session and agree upon a full state match. It should also be noted that the state of Minnesota is sitting on a record budget surplus that can fully and completely match the 20% that is required for this funding. This is absolutely unacceptable. Fresh Energy has an action alert out asking the Minnesota Legislature to come back together and ensure that our state doesn't miss out on this historic opportunity to increase our state's resilience and develop a robust workforce for the clean energy economy. Please join us in contacting state legislatures by filling out the action alert that is linked on this slide. Next slide, please. Thank you so much for all of your time today. If you have any questions or discussion items, please reach out to me at the email on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next, we're going to have our own Dean Taylor, who is going to be talking about the best practices for corridor charging to assure a really first-rate consumer experience, which is something we care about a lot at Plug in America. Welcome, Dean.
Good afternoon, everyone. While my slides come up, I just want to emphasize that I'll be talking about the need for kind of continuous improvement to improve the consumer experience. This is a 5-year effort to build out both the corridor and the community charging. There's lots of room for improvement to have a better experience for consumers, for site hosts, and for all the other priority communities, such as the ones you just heard about. I won't have time to go through all my slides. I'm going to try to catch us up a little bit on the agenda. But what we'd like to do is challenge Minnesota and other states to go beyond the minimum federal requirements so that when they issue the RFPs to select the vendors, that they have stronger minimum requirements than what the federal guidance will come out later on this month. In addition, we'd like to see Minnesota and other states start awarding bonus points when they're scoring the applicant responses to the RFPs. And several other states are already doing this so that you basically reward excellence. And then lastly, there's a lot of room for improvement by having working groups with federal, state, and other stakeholders. If you could go to the next slide, I'll cover a few things, but I'll skim over most of my presentation. Obviously, we want a network without gaps. We'd like to have people not wonder, do I have the right connector to charge? We like to see an extremely reliable charging experience. You may have seen news reports even in places like California where sometimes it's 75% of the chargers are working, 25% are not. That's just unacceptable. We have to get to a much, much better experience. And also to be able to see real-time availability and not have wait times, to be able to easily pay anywhere, just not for the rich, but also for people who are unbanked and underbanked, and to achieve some load management benefits. Next slide. In addition, from a site host perspective, the stations need to be replaceable. If you want to change vendors or the company becomes bankrupt, drivers need to be able to see and compare charging prices. The cost of charging needs to continually be lowered, and we have some best practices on that. Obviously, avoid cybersecurity and be able to really benefit from a robust data collection process, which really does not exist as it should today. Next slide, please. I'm going to skim really quickly here, Ellie, through these slides. We want something better for minimum fully built out charging network than what exists today. I mean, for example, in North Dakota along the interstate, Tesla has 8 charging stations. We think we could, build out and future-proof better for the future, and even have chargers placed closer together in urban areas than the 50 miles apart, which is in there today. So for example, maybe 15 miles in the urban areas. Next slide. This will all be posted. You'll have a chance to see this on our website. And on reliability, we'd like to see 97% uptime and other things. Go to the next slide, Ellie. Remote start capability, major repairs within 48 hours. On equity, we would like to see a requirement so that the vendors have to bid on both low and high traffic utilization areas with the same price for charging, so you don't have redlining, high prices to charge in rural areas. We have a bunch of things to help on bonus points to help on this. I'm going to skip over to try to catch up. Next slide. We have a lot of ways to reduce costs. I'm not going to have time to go into all of that, but you can have caps on what is paid for make ready or for a charger or for all costs. You could have requirements that the vendors take advantage of existing tax credits. Next slide. You could have better placement of DC fast charging. There's obviously a tension between reducing costs and having a really good consumer experience. So here is an example of where we're looking for a lower cost solution, just basically telling the vendor to do something on vehicle grid integration by submitting something to the state energy office or local utility, giving some flexibility because there's a lot of different ways you can better integrate with the grid. So some flexibility there. Next slide. And there's things you can do to future-proof. Next slide. And I'll just maybe end by saying in the appendix, we go into even more things on how to reduce cost, on paper performance requirements, for example. And here you're seeing on this slide the potential for working groups. There's a lot of work to be done on interoperability, make sure that each different EV can work with each charging station so that other various standards and connector issues are dealt with, that there's a robust effort on how to reduce costs further, how to really dive into the details of data collection, and better placement of charging sites, especially in rural areas, supply chain issues. Next slide. You'll see when this is posted, some other things that we're doing is recommendations on signage, data collection, payment systems. Like I said, it needs to also work for the unbanked and underbanked, network requirements, and other federal actions. So hopefully I've caught us up a little bit on the time. Thank you so much for having me speak.
Thank you, Dean, for zooming through your slides to try to catch us up. So we are now going to take a quick break, a 5-minute break. So we will be starting up again in exactly 5 minutes. So hopefully that's enough time to stretch your legs, grab a cup of coffee, and come back refreshed. So we'll see everyone in 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Like we said, 5 minutes is 5 minutes. So we're now going to be diving into our panel session. We have a fantastic group of expert panelists today, including Siri Simons that we just heard from at Mndot, Tony Fisher at Met Council, Will Stein at Minnesota Federal Highways, Elise Trudeau at Minnesota State Energy Office, Tandy Dilworth at Excel Energy, Robert Blake of Native Sun that represents tribal voices in Minnesota, Stacey O'Rourke from Pine City, which is a city along the I-35, Alex Beaton from EVgo, it's a charging company, Rebecca Place at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and Tim Gross from the Minnesota Petroleum Marketers Association that represents convenience stores and fueling stations in the state. So to start the panel off, Siri Simons from Mndot is going to come back and share additional information about Minnesota's plans.
Thanks, Joel. Ellie, are you able to pull up my slides again? Great, thank you. So if you're just joining, I'm Siri Simons. I'm the Sustainability Program Supervisor with Mndot Sustainability and Public Health Division. And I presented earlier on these high-level look at how Mndot is planning for the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program funds. And this is a little bit more into the details of what we plan to do with the first year of funds and some of the things that we've learned attempting to use federal funds for EV charging stations. So next slide, please. So part of our planning process involves putting together this draft EV fast charging network. This shows where we could spend all 5 years of the formula funds. And we're starting with the alternative fuel corridors in Minnesota, which are highlighted in green on this map. So we can head to the next slide, please. So I really want to focus on how we're going to be using the funds for the first year along 94 and 35. And the first step in moving towards potential locations along those corridors was a suitability analysis of exits. So HDR, our consultant, put that together, and I'll be sharing some slides on that in just a minute or so. We are working to get feedback on the initial suitability analysis, including information from utilities about potential sites for the fast chargers, and then that will be folded into a map of potential locations for fast chargers. So it won't be at the site level, it will still be a little bit broader than that. And then that map will be reviewed by the steering team that's guiding our plan, which is called the EV subgroup, before it's incorporated into our final plan that we submit to the joint office. Next slide, please. So these are the scoring criteria that we used for this suitability analysis. And the suitability analysis is really a first pass or a screen of all of the exits along 94 and 35 that can help us determine where we want to site fast chargers with the Nevi funds. So we used a Justice 40 criterion where exits received more points if they were closer to a Justice 40 community. We also had a proximity to substations criterion. So exits received more points the closer they were to a substation, with maximum points being 10 if they were within less than half a mile of a substation. We also scored them higher if they intersected with other corridors, and then higher if they were close to an existing DC fast charger, although this analysis slide is a little bit dated and we've adjusted that criterion slightly. So now it's 5 points instead of 10 points for that proximity to DC fast chargers criterion. So Ellie, if you click again, I think it will bring up the initial map. So you can see the dots that are orange and red are more suitable exits, and then dots that are green or blue are less suitable exits. And if you click again or go to the next slide, these arrows show up. So these are the groupings of more suitable exits that are starting to emerge from our suitability analysis. And you can see along 94, we've got the Fargo-Moorhead area, Fergus Falls, Alexandria, St. Cloud, and then the Twin Cities, which I'll get to in a second. And then along 35, we've got Duluth, Moose Lake, Hinckley, Forest Lake, Faribault, and Albert Lea. So these are just our first pass of potentially suitable exits for the chargers. This is what we're really interested in getting feedback on today and in the next couple of weeks as we move towards those potential charger locations that will be invested in with the first year of the program funds. So I said that I would talk a little bit more about the Twin Cities, and we can go to the next slide for that. So we are still working through where to site chargers in the Twin Cities. There's a lot of potentially suitable exits. And I think there's discussion to be had about how closely the chargers should be spaced in the Twin Cities. The minimum requirement is 50 miles apart per the Nevi guidance, but they could be closer together. So this is something that I'm really hoping there will be discussion on in the breakout sessions today, in an area where we haven't yet identified specific groupings of potential sites for fast chargers just yet. Next slide, please. So we started off with that suitability analysis, and then I mentioned we're working to gather additional information from utilities. So Power Systems Engineering developed a survey to gather input from Minnesota cooperatives that will help inform our planning process. And specifically, the survey asked for information about three-phase power and the capacity of the distribution system at exits along 94 and 35. And so we've gathered information through that survey. We also thought it was so valuable that Mndot and HDR put together a very similar survey that we have shared with other utilities in Minnesota, specifically our municipal utilities and the IOUs. And so we're using that information to make sure that we're selecting potential locations for the fast chargers that are more likely to have capacity to support the chargers. So that's going to be layered into the analysis. And if you head to the next slide, there's a couple of other things that we are going to be incorporating into our analysis as well. So certainly that utility data information from public and stakeholder engagement that's happening right now. And then we're also looking at population and EV registration data, as well as long distance trips to help us think through where we really should be optimizing the locations of these fast chargers. And then we're also thinking about costs. So for the first year of the program, we've got $10 million. Conservative assumptions are that these sites are going to cost about $1 million each. So really, we're talking about 10 sites in the first year of the program, approximately, maybe give or take 2. So trying to figure out what are the top 10 general locations that these chargers should be installed in that first year. And then we're also thinking about ease of access. This is something that has really come up in engagement, that we need to make sure that we're picking exits that make sense because they're easy to access and they also get at density and provide opportunities to touch on some of the themes that MK was talking about. So we are going to layer all of this information into our analysis to get to this map of potential charging station locations with the first year program funds. That will then be reviewed by our steering team, the EV subgroup, and Mndot leadership, and then it will be incorporated into the plan. So that's really how we're going to get to those locations for the first year. And we can go to the next slide. I did want to just mention a little bit about the pilot that our team has been running the last couple of years. We created a program called the Clean Transportation Pilot Program that will distribute $2 million each year of federal funds to clean transportation projects. So the first year of projects were selected, the first tranche of projects were selected in March of 2020, and they did include some EV charging station projects. And so if you go to the next slide, as we've been working to put together the contracts for those EV charging projects, we've learned a lot. And one of the things that we've learned is that some of the federal requirements, specifically for federal transportation funding, are really new to the EV industry, and they can be challenging for our partners to meet. Buy America is certainly a challenging one that we have experienced some delays around. I would say the industry is working to prepare to meet that requirement because of the Nevi program. So that may not be as much of an issue as it was for us in 2021. The National Environmental Policy Act documentation is another area where we face some challenges. That documentation needs to be complete for sites to get the authorization to spend federal funds on a project. And so that's maybe a little bit different than the way that the industry typically does things, where maybe a grantee is selected and then they're allowed to coordinate within a community to select an optimal site and then move forward. So NEPA documentation just creates sort of a different flow of steps in the process towards moving towards a contract. And then competitive solicitation requirements. Federal funds have to be given out after we go through a competitive solicitation process to select a grantee. And so that introduces some complexities, especially when there's different players involved in a project. So these are things that we're thinking about as we're preparing for the Nevi funds, along with the fact that contracting can take a while. We estimate 6 to 12 months just to get the contract in place. And then there may be additional supply chain delays on top of that. So as we think about when the chargers will actually be deployed with the Nevi funds, I think spring 2023 is probably the earliest that we could expect, just trying to set realistic expectations around timing. So I wanted to share that information as we get into this conversation now about installing and deploying chargers, because these are all things that we will be keeping in mind at Mndot as we are preparing to put together a program guide for the Nevi funds, which is really our next step after the plan is submitted. So I think this was my last slide. And I think I'll turn it back to you, Joel.
Okay, thank you very much. So now we have our panel discussion. Everybody, you can turn on your cameras if you haven't done that yet. So we're going to go into some questions for the panel. And I'm going to start out with kind of a question for everybody about process. So I guess my first question is for anyone who cares to answer, what does a good stakeholder process look like? What would you all like to see in the stakeholder, the whole outreach process to really bring in a diverse set of voices? So I welcome anybody who wants to speak. Maybe raise your hand first if you want. Okay, Tandy, go ahead.
Thank you. So, I would say that stakeholders are really critical, and engaging them is a key to the success, for this EV charging station deployment. And I really do think a strong example has been the efforts of Mndot in terms of how to engage stakeholders. It's been particularly effective in engaging different groups such as utilities that I represent, consumers and others, in having the right conversations. And I think as far as a diverse stakeholder engagement process, we really try to make this concept complicated, but it's not. It is simply having different voices in the room. When you have different voices in the room, you get different ideas. When you have different ideas, you get different processes. When you have different processes, you get different solutions. And when you have different solutions, that's how you achieve the goal. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Alex with EVgo.
Thanks, Joel. And I would echo everything Tandy just said. I also wanted to add, I think it's really important for Mndot and other states to be soliciting stakeholder feedback at every step of the process. So this is really fantastic and helpful as you all develop your state plan, but then also when you're developing the grant solicitation or RFP, stakeholder input can be really helpful at that stage as well. But then also in future years of the program to see what worked well in year one, what are the parts we want to replicate, and what are the parts that we see some room for improvement. So continuing that stakeholder feedback through the future years to iterate on the program is another kind of key piece of success in our mind.
Okay, thanks. So let's move on and talk about some of the basic floors or thresholds that the DOT set in the requirements. So there's a requirement that a fully built out corridor has to have charging at least every 50 miles and at least 4 chargers per site. Dean had suggested in his comments that for urban areas, we might want to look at something as short as 15 miles. So I welcome thoughts from people about sort of those minimum floors and how do those feel to folks? Tony, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I can jump in a little bit, especially with regard to the 50-mile minimum spacing or maximum spacing. I think in the Twin Cities, there are a lot of opportunities to really reduce greenhouse gases, improve public health, and really serve a lot of people with a denser charging network. It's also an opportunity to really provide revenue to that charging industry and really, help shift this more towards a private sector model. So I think those are some real opportunities.
Thanks. Will?
Yeah, I just want to mention some of our guidance that has already been issued by the Joint Office, which really encourages leveraging private investment. So that might be a way to move above and beyond sort of the minimums that we've put out there. But it's really strongly encouraged in our guidance that's been put out so forth to try to leverage additional investment from the private sector.
Rebecca?
I'd add to that just not to lock ourselves into any number, because the perfect site might just be 1 mile less or more than what we choose. So it does need to be closer than the 50 miles, especially we're in the most densely populated areas. But then, look at the matching funds, like what was said, and also the great site locations.
Okay. How do we future-proof our investments? How do we make sure that the infrastructure that we're putting in the ground now isn't going to be obsolete in 5 years? Are there things that we should do to go beyond the minimum thresholds, or other things we should be doing to make sure that this is infrastructure that's going to last us for many years?
If I could go ahead, Lise Trudeau, Minnesota Department of Commerce Energy Office. I think the grid capacity at those locations will be one of the more important factors in order to future-proof as cars develop with longer ranges and as we look more towards longer haul vehicles.
So building out capacity. Alex, with EVgo? You're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. One of the simplest ways we think you can future-proof is kind of oversizing the underground conduits so that you're not kind of digging again to build those new sites. We do think it's future-proofing. There's a balance to strike between building out larger stations and building additional ones to serve new geographies, which we don't think is a bad idea either, because there is going to be need for more charging stations in different locations. So it's all of a balance. For EVgo's part, we're definitely installing 350 kilowatt chargers, which are definitely a form of future-proofing, because only a handful of vehicles can really approach that charging speed now. But in 5 or so years, there will be many more that can charge at those speeds. So making those decisions on the front end about the charger speed will help make sure you're serving where the vehicles are over the lifespan of the asset.
The threshold, I think, in the guidance is 150, but you guys are doing 350.
Yeah, often our 350 kilowatt chargers, and you can see the two behind my left shoulder on the screen are 350 kilowatt chargers. They have power sharing abilities. So, if one car pulls up and it can take 200 kilowatts, but then another car can pull up and take the remaining 150 kilowatts. That way you're kind of serving both cars where they are. So that's another great technology that kind of meets where the market is in the moment, but then provides that kind of upper end speed as more cars hit the market and have that on their charging curves.
Thanks. Siri, Mndot?
I just want to say that both of the points that Lisa and Alex made reflect input that we've heard as we've been developing the draft plan. So there's been interest in pull-through sites to prep for medium and heavy-duty vehicles, and then there's also interest in 350 kilowatt chargers because that's, I think, really the direction that the industry is headed. And so as we think about how to actually incorporate that into our program guidance, we are exploring what it could look like to do something like have bonus points for pull-through sites at certain locations where it might be a better fit, or to have bonus points for the 350 kilowatt chargers. We're really trying to figure out what the right balance is there. Alex, I think you used exactly the right word, balance, because we are trying to determine how to future-proof while also being responsible with the funds that we have and not overspending and oversizing with the first year of funds. So really interested in hearing more about that throughout the discussion today.
Stacy?
One of the things we're working on is just education, just trying to explain to our community how you are able to travel in these vehicles with the charging stations that we're installing. And because we are so rural, that's a big fear that we're going to run out. So just education is huge on our standpoint.
Becca?
Okay. I think a couple things. One, just having multiple stations, they're getting bigger and better all the time. So, there might be one station that has 4 plugs but we all know that stations have problems. So, having it so that there's multiple, even if we have a couple 350s or a couple 150s, just for those when they do go down. And then also just location. It's the parking lot on the edge of town where you have to walk into town to frequent the businesses that may or may not be open is not as great as a site that's, right next to the grocery store that's been there for 50 years, that will be there. So definitely location.
Tandy?
Thank you. So I guess I just want to weigh in to say, future proofing is a challenge because the technology is changing so much right now in this space. So there are breakthroughs and there's new technology coming. And so encouraging the industry to develop in a way that accounts for future flexibility will also help us to future proof these sites, and discourages kind of the propagation of proprietary equipment, apps and payment systems, et cetera. And just encouraging, long-term maintenance and service agreements are in place to ensure that stations remain functional that are actually put out there. And also, maybe taking a real options approach where you can either upgrade or retrofit these stations much more easily as technology changes. So I think it's a challenge to be able to future-proof, but it's also a commitment that we have to try to make right now.
Okay. So let me direct a question to Native Son. So what role do tribal sovereign nations have in driving the EV transition and ensuring greater access?
Yeah, thanks, Joel. Thanks for the question. I really see tribal nations, and of course, I've been trying to engage NIAGA, the Native American Indian Gaming Association, around this very issue around charging stations, and how do we get the tribal casinos involved in a way that they're also purchasing and operating these charging stations, and also too, and while we're also speaking to the tribes, this being an opportunity job creator for these communities, where they can use the use the funds from these charging stations to help with their budgets and also create jobs for their community members too. So that's the way that that we've been engaging with the tribes. And then also, I think I heard also on the panel here, education and outreach has been a big thing too. So that's another aspect that we've been trying to really leverage with tribal nations, and help them be a part of this EV charging network.
This is for Tim. How should the state be coordinating with small retailers, convenience stores, and gas stations on deploying fast chargers across the state?
I appreciate it. Thanks for the question. Now, really quick, the Minnesota Petroleum Marketers, we're made up of 450 businesses that own and operate the majority of the 250 current refueling sites found across Minnesota. Our refueling marketers have over a 100-year-long history of providing the energy needs for transportation, and we want to continue to provide for tomorrow's travelers. To the question of coordination, we have our members have a long history of dealing with federal and state programs, dealing with grants and Nevi type funds. What best works for our members is a direct relationship connection with the state agencies. We find that to be the most effective and efficient. That being said, I think our association can plan once the Mndot, like Siri has mentioned, identifies areas of need along these corridors. We have members willing, able, and ready to step up and meet these requirements and help with the matching funds. But there are some real, with that coordination, there's some real key points on criteria for our members. These current refueling sites require options, flexibility, and security when it comes to the installation, equipment, software, and networking of these EV charging installations. You know, these options can range from the purchase, ownership, operations, and maintenance of this equipment to the other end range of this of just acting as a host site or somewhere in between. Also, the new charging software must be flexible and customizable to allow the integration to our current business operations and back office software packages. The networking of the business and customer data must be protected and kept private. And then finally, any type of deployment must ensure an open and free flow of funding and investment to all eligible stakeholders.
So going back to one of the questions that this is kind of a theme that came up before is the balance between the urban areas and greater Minnesota. How do we find that balance? You know, what do we look for? I don't know if people have thoughts in, you know, what's the relative focus on urban versus rural versus kind of the larger state. Tony?
Yeah, I'll jump on this again. I mean, I think it's a both and. I mean, there's a lot of needs in the rural areas to serve the state, to serve residents of rural areas, and to serve residents of the Twin Cities. There's a lot of needs in the Twin Cities. There are interstates that were built through communities, and those communities are still suffering the public health impacts of those highways. And so there's a lot of needs in the Twin Cities, and I really hope the balance is it's a both and kind of answer.
Alex?
Totally agree. They're both very important and you need coverage, you know, across the state to be able to serve all drivers. I think the important thing is to view the challenges of each of them through their own lens. So in rural areas, in our experience, the most difficult part of operating there is that the utilization for the chargers is just lower because there's fewer people there to charge. So one of the really important policy levers that Mndot has to pull from the Nevi program is the ability to provide operations and maintenance assistance for chargers. And we don't necessarily think that'll be necessary in most urban areas where there's going to be demand for chargers, but in these rural areas, that tool can really help bridge the gap between where utilization is today and where utilization is 5 years from now when more folks are driving EVs and there's greater demand for the chargers.
Will?
Yeah, one user in urban areas that I would just like to understand better, and it's been alluded to, is people that live in apartments or you know, can't for whatever reason, for a number of reasons, put in a level 2 charger in their garage, and just understand better what would work best for them in terms of location, in terms of fast chargers versus more level 2 chargers at the place where they live. I think it's, I guess, a part of stakeholder engagement that I'd like to learn more about, and maybe some of the other panelists have already some thoughts on that.
Anybody thoughts about apartment dwellers? Alex?
Just quickly, I think it's all of the above. We're going to need all levels of charging all over the place. So it's where they live. You know, we did a study in partnership with UCLA that looked at the charging habits of folks in apartments, and a plurality of them who couldn't charge at home did use public fast charging. So that is an important piece. But, you know, level 2 charging at apartment buildings or condos, at workplaces will all be also great solutions for those folks.
Right. Challenge you need to be careful about is that if you create a situation where people in apartments, particularly lower income people in apartments, are being pushed to fast charging, then you've got, you know, the most expensive charging solution being provided to the people who can least afford it. So you need to figure out a way that you know that you're not exclusively doing that. Rebecca, go ahead.
We're using the Volkswagen settlement funds in Minnesota to try to complement the Nevi funds and fill the gaps where Nevi probably won't fill in, which is that multi-unit dwelling piece. And so in our plans, we wrote that we would fund multi-unit dwellings charging, and also putting a focus on the mobility hubs. So, you know, in the Twin Cities now we have the ride share program, where if we can put in even more charging for that, then that hits the community that may not own an EV but could still have the opportunity to drive one.
So let's talk about the role of utilities. Obviously, utilities are essential in the success of this. Any thought about what's the balance, and where should utilities be involved, and what should their role look like as we're building out this plan and rolling it out?
So I think that might be addressed toward me.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I'll take that. So really, you know, Xcel Energy is a key and committed utility partner in Minnesota. So we have over 1.4 million electric customers, and we are committed to working with them and our other stakeholders and regulators. So as the provider, you know, of the fuel, if you will, the electricity, the utility really plays an integral role in ensuring the effective and efficient use of Nevi formula funding. And I would say, you know, kind of in 3 ways at a minimum. So one, you know, utilities participate as a key partner and be at the table in the plans that are being filed on August 1st that the state must file to receive its funding. So, you know, we are working with the states on these plans. The second is really that the grid is ready. So, you know, assessing the potential sites and advising on the grid infrastructure to include, you know, the distribution substation capacity in the area, transformer loading and health, costs and timelines to upgrade the grid, you know, in the cited areas, and so forth. So the business that the utility really does, the core business. And then thirdly, you know, really that the utility steps up as an economic partner and engages in conversations about potential partnerships, or, you know, serves as that non-federal cost share partner through direct investment, enrolling fast charging stations in existing utility programs or creating new programs. So, you know, Xcel Energy has several programs that can be utilized right now in order to help deploy this funding and the charging, and to make an interconnected network. So this really means that the utility, as well as the state, has a stake in the success of the fast charging network, and also in its continued operation. So you know, again, mentioning these programs today that can and should be leveraged. And if more is needed from the utility, you know, we are definitely positioned to respond, and we will continue to step up to support this area.
Thank you. So let's talk about reliability a little bit. I know that from our perspective as EV drivers, reliability is really, really important. When we've done surveys of drivers, we hear that is near the very top of the list of what drivers are worried about, because the last thing you want is you're driving through a remote area, you're planning on a charger being available and it's not there. It's broken, or there's 6 people waiting in line, or whatever. It's be catastrophic. So I would love to hear thoughts from anybody about what kind of requirements for reliability should Minnesota be requiring for this network. Lise, I see your hand.
Thank you. I first of all just want to echo a comment earlier. I'm not sure who made it, but that redundancy aspect, even just returning last summer from a long haul trip with a gasoline vehicle, finding a station out when we were on fumes was a bit distressing. So I can appreciate the redundancy aspect, but also especially for those communities that are relying on have access to charging, making sure those stations are reliable, and especially in disruptive events, outage events, starting to look at ways to provide backup power as we shift to increasingly electrified transportation.
Siri?
Yeah, I would agree that that is a critical consideration for us, and we are required in our plans to describe our approach to resilience for the charging station. So it's certainly something that we're thinking about. I would just add that sort of maintenance and reliability of stations has been a key theme in our in-person engagement in Minneapolis and Duluth last week. I would guess that it will be a key theme in our upcoming engagement events. And we will be including uptime requirements for the bidders. I'm not exactly sure what they will be. We're kind of waiting to see what federal guidance comes out this week, because I know there have been different numbers tossed around, anywhere between 95 and 99% uptime. But we're really interested in collecting some more information from the installers about how they will meet that uptime requirement. I think it's one thing just to check a box on an application and say that uptime will be, that a certain uptime requirement will be met, but it's another to demonstrate that that's something that is actually happening at other stations. So we are kind of working to understand what strong documentation would look like in our process.
Thanks. So let's talk a little bit about rural stations and the higher costs of operating those. That was something Alex had mentioned before, can be a challenge. What should Minnesota do to make sure that people are able to provide stations in more remote areas or less heavily trafficked? Should there be something to make sure that the prices are consistent across the board, so that they don't end up charging more for those, or like what needs to be done to make sure that rural areas are properly supported, given the higher cost of running those stations, at least in the near term? Tim?
Not sure how to take my hand down, so I'll see. Oh, there you go. I believe stakeholders like us need to work and support the major utilities addressing the issues with the PUC and with smaller utilities and dealing with the installation and operation of EV chargers. And that really includes two things: help develop fair and equitable processes and plans for cost recovery for the utilities, and then address the new rate structures for these fast level 3 chargers, leaving behind the current demand charges that may hamper private investment and consumer choices because of the increased costs.
Okay, thanks. So I think we need to wrap up this session now. I don't know if anyone has one last kind of deep, insightful thought they want to leave with us before we move on. Ooh, I see Lise has a deep thought to leave with us now.
Probably especially helpful if I unmute. I don't know if it's deep and insightful, but I think it would be remiss if we didn't mention thinking about rate structures and demand charges as we build out these high demand units is going to be an important consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you all very much. This was a great conversation. It's amazing what you can do remotely. So this worked out really well. So thank you all. And we're going to move on now to our next speaker. We have Moaz Udin from the Great Plains Institute is going to deliver a presentation on additional federal funding for EV charging, transit, school buses, and batteries for Minnesota.
Thank you, Joe. Will everyone hear me? And Ali, I think if you could please share the presentation.
Yes, we hear you, and it should be up in just a second.
Well, so I guess in the interest of time, I'll get started, and I'm going to keep this short. This presentation serves as a quick recap of the EV programs and provisions in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. before we move on to the breakout discussion where we can talk about possibilities for Minnesota. So I won't go into the details of the program, but maybe I'll give a brief overview. If you can move on to the next slide, please. So we'll divide this into the programs that are focused on EVs, and then there are other programs where EVs and related components and chargers are also eligible. So that first row over there shows that 8.75 billion has been allocated to EVs and charging infrastructure. And then there's more for EVs if you look at the 10.3 billion that's available for grid upgrades and the development of supply chains for EV batteries. And then if we look at all of the existing programs and some new programs that have either been reauthorized or have expanded budgets, which have EV related provisions included, that's another $101.8 billion pool which states can tap into. And so it is important to note that with the 101 billion pool I'm talking about, they're funds that are marked for transportation, air quality improvement, carbon reduction, among other things. So EVs and charging are going to be eligible for some of these funds, but they're not dedicated to them. Another thing, I think one of the few things I wanted to impart today is that if we try to, back of the envelope do a calculation to see what Minnesota's expected share could be out of the 101 billion we're talking about over here. If we look at the funding to Minnesota coming proportionate to Minnesota's population relative to the total US population, which is 1.7%. This is $1.9 billion. Of course, many of these programs have different formulas, how the funds will come to the state, and some of them are competitive programs. So there, it's literally how competitive the application is that decides what the funding is going to be. But the next 4 slides are going to be about the EV and charging dedicated programs. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. This is the Nevi program, which has been talked about, $5 billion for EV charging, 68 million for Minnesota. The details are here, and many of these slides will also have links. So for those who are interested in more details, you can come back to these slides and perhaps click on those links and get even more details. Next slide, please. This is the $2.5 billion competitive grant program, which is also for EV charging. Next slide, please. This is the Clean School Bus Program, another $5 billion for clean and electric school buses. Next slide, please. Now, last of the 4 electric vehicle or electric transportation related programs is the electric or low emitting clean ferry program, which is $250 million. Next slide, please. So I've also included a list of those other programs which all combine to form the $101 billion pool I was talking about. So the next 2 slides are about that. If you please move on. So this first slide, you see some of the funds that are available for chargers, grid upgrades, as well as the EV supply chain investments I talked about. And then the slide after this is where we have some medium and heavy duty vehicles that are eligible. So basically grants for transit authorities and other government and non-government organizations who want to invest in electric vehicles. Next slide, please. Yes, this slide shows it's the similar programs as on the previous slide, but this includes the programs that also are eligible to be used for the actual purchase of electric vehicles, not just related components in charging infrastructure. Next slide, please. So I've also included 3 slides with some links which you can come back to over here, and these include the open programs that we have right now, which agencies and eligible entities can apply for. So on the first slide over here, we have the battery investment. So this is for battery manufacturing, actually material processing too, and recycling. And then the next slide, if you move on, please, is the Clean School Bus Program. We already have a $500 million rebate program open for this year. And then the last slide over here, if you please move on. This is another open, well, not open anymore. It actually shut down for this year, but we'll have it next year and every year from now on. This was mentioned earlier too on today's webinar. This is the Lower No Emission Grant Program for transit buses, and we expect this to come back next year and the year after because the funding's already been announced. So with that, I'm going to end this whirlwind tour of IIJA and let us move on to the breakout session. And please, if you have any questions about these programs, do feel free to reach out to me. And hopefully you'll have more information on the slides and the links that we have on those slides. Let you take it back from here, Joel.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's really remarkable. So when you think about transportation electrification more broadly, there's just all kinds of other things in the IIJA. It goes well beyond this initial $5 billion. There's all kinds of different programs. So we're now going to be taking another quick 5-minute break before we go into our breakout rooms. And when we return, my colleague Alexia from Plug-in America is going to be introducing the breakout sessions. There will be 4 topics that you can choose from: rural corridor charging, urban corridor charging, community charging, and school buses, transit, and battery manufacturing and recycling. So you can choose whichever of those sessions is the most helpful or relevant for your work and interests. So we'll see everyone back here in 5 minutes. So thank you all. See you in 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, I'll just give everyone a second to land back in this room. Thank you so much for all of your crucial feedback in the breakout sessions. We'll be aggregating this input to share a comprehensive report and inviting you to similar opportunities to continue this conversation. I'd like to now turn it over to Plug-in America's Policy Director, Pete Chipman, for comments on next steps and to start to close this out here.
Thanks, Alexi, and thanks for all your help, and Ellie, who's behind the scenes as well on this event. It's just been a real pleasure to have all the key players in the same room, and we look to do that again with the forum in the fall and the $2.5 billion. And please feel free to reach out to me directly, pchipman@pluginamerica.org. And if you're interested in doing similar events where all the key players are in the same room, we're happy to do so. And I'm just going to pass it over quickly to Dean and Moaz. I want to say Dean has been instrumental in previous forums and we helped us build upon that with the current forum. He's been involved since the 90s with the EV legislation, just a real powerhouse. And Dean, Moaz, we can't say enough from his help from a Minnesota perspective with Drive Electric Minnesota. So Dean and Moaz, if you want to close us out, go ahead, Dean.
Yeah, I'm the representative for Plug-in America in Minnesota. I've been working here now for 3 years, and just really excited to see what we can do to make Minnesota a leader. Obviously, there's 18 states that are ZEV states. I think Minnesota can definitely be well above average compared to the 50 states in what we do in the next 5 years. So thank you all for joining. I appreciate it. Moaz, anything?
Thank you very much, Dean. It's been a great opportunity to talk to so many people from different parts of the supply chain. That's how we're looking at the EV industry right now. And Minnesota is just uniquely positioned there. Like we can start right from upstream all the way to the end of that stream, and can contribute everywhere along the line. So just very excited to see where these funds take us, and where we go over the next 5 years with EVs. Thank you.
And Alexia, we'd be remiss if we didn't thank our boss, Joel Levin, for being such a great MC, but I'm going to let you close it off with some final word.
Got it. Well, thank you everyone for participating with us today. And as you've heard, we'll be following up with more information and additional opportunities for future conversations. But we really appreciate your participation and your feedback here. It's going to go a long way towards helping to shape Minnesota's plan on federal funding and how we're developing EV charging infrastructure for years to come. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you later down the line.
Bye.
Have a good day, everyone.
Take care.